There's no way Mark could have gotten to that level of ability in Greek without having extensive experience in Homeric Greek. So he is as thoroughly versed in Greek as, let's say, a German student who comes to America and does 14 years up to graduate school status in English literature. Like, he knows Greek at least that well.
Mark is much more sophisticated than his simple grammar would indicate.
Matthew is much more facile with Greek than he is with Hebrew. He's reliant on the Septuagint for his understanding of the Old Testament.
Dr. Richard Carrier, another question, and maybe we'll have Dennis tag in, like you guys are a wrestling team. Mark's limited vocabulary has led some scholars to infer that Greek was not his native tongue. If this were to be true, are you able to perceive any hints as to Mark's original language? Are you able to sense any awkwardness in his construction of Greek?
No awkwardness, no. It is simplistic, though, like almost deliberately so. I think he's deliberately writing in a colloquial vocabulary and a colloquial discourse style with simple sentence structure for either of two reasons or both at the same time. One is he wants that audience, so he doesn't want to lose the audience with highfalutin Greek. The other reason, I suspect, is that he would have found highfalutin Greek very offensive. To him, that's arrogant and prideful, whereas simple language, simple structure is more humble and therefore more representative of the gospel. So I think that I can't prove that those are his motives, but both of those motives are available motives. They make sense and they would explain what we're looking at. And so it's more like what I've often do the analogy of Mark Twain. So Mark Twain, definitely educated guy, knows what he's doing, but he deliberately chose to write in colloquial discourse style. So I think that's what Mark is doing as well. And he might have various reasons why he would do that. More importantly, in some of these other clips that we've done, this has come up as well, there's no way Mark could have gotten to that level of ability in Greek without having extensive experience in Homeric Greek. Like, there was no way to go to school for Greek without that. You couldn't advance to that level without mastering it. So he definitely knows, he has a high vocabulary, he definitely knows how to, he could, imitate Homer in meticulous detail if he wanted to. He had to have had that skill, because there's no way to get Greek back then without having that skill. So he is consciously choosing not to do that. And so with regard to native Greek, I haven't really looked into the scholarship on that because I don't think it matters. It doesn't matter what he grew up as a baby speaking, because, once again, he's gone through what the equivalent of about 10 to 14 years of education in Greek to get to the point where he is. It is the equivalent, and when I do, in my book, The Science Education in the Early Roman Empire, I go through the stages of Greek schooling that you have to go through to get to this point, to where you can actually compose narratives the way Mark is doing. And it's a grueling process of, like I said, 10 to 14 years to get there. So he is as thoroughly versed in Greek as, let's say, a German student who comes to America and does 14 years up to graduate school status in English literature. Like, he knows Greek at least that well, right? So it doesn't matter what he grew up speaking. It's not really relevant to anything that I work with. It might be interesting to certain people for their own particular reasons, but it isn't anything I need to resolve for the work that I do, for the things that I'm interested in. I remember coming up in academia and being told and reading constantly that Mark must have been near illiterate, that he's like some yokel because the simplicity of the Greek. And I just believed that. I just thought that, that's what all the scholars are saying. It was when I started studying this full on that I realized that was completely false. It's just not even possible that that's the case. And that does come from the experience of studying ancient education. I studied under Raffaele Cribiori, who's expert on ancient education, and William Harris, who's expert on ancient literacy. So I studied under them at Columbia, and it was through their schooling that I understood, this claim about Mark is completely misinformed. It doesn't understand the context at all. That isn't how one learns Greek. You don't just learn it on the street and then write elegant compositions like Mark has done. So that's my answer to that question. Dennis might have other answers because
it's a great question, and I think Richard is exactly right. We wouldn't think that Mark's Greek was inferior had we not had Luke Acts, because Luke comes along and he's writing for most excellent Theophilus.
yes,
That is, this is Pepide of many. He's writing for intellects. He's writing for the educated. He's writing for the smart money. And he does think Mark is a little too rusticus, too pedestrian, and he's trying to up the ante. And Greek seems to be his native language, but he seems to know some Latin and some Aramaic, and
Mark does.
Mark,
yeah,
and he actually quotes Hebrew, and has Jesus speak Hebrew.
Yeah, this is correct.
So that we have the word for centurion is the Latin transliteration.
I think there's more Latinisms in Mark than any of the other Gospels.
That's exactly right. Or think of legion. And he expects his readers to know what a legion is. That's a direct transliteration of Latin. But he also has word plays in Aramaic that he expects his readers to be able to get. Boanerges, Talithakum, or Cooney, depending on the text. Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, which is a kind of a hybrid.
That's a good example, where you've got a Greek but with the Hebrew prefix.
Iscariot, in my view, comes out of Is, into, and Kariote, which is Aramaic for the city, into the city. Magdalene makes sense if you know that Magdala means a tower, and it identifies Mary Magdalene with Andromache, who watches her husband die from a tower. There are, in other words, Mark is much more sophisticated than his simple grammar would indicate. And he's a polyglot to some extent. And he expects some of his readers to have enough Aramaic in order to understand this. When Papias talks about Mark and Matthew, he thinks that both Peter and Matthew spoke Aramaic, because you have Aramaic both in the Q document. Sorry, Richard, and
it's all over the Gospels.
But in Mark, so that Mark is much more sophisticated than we've known. Now, the register of Greek is very similar to other sophisticated literature. The life of Aesop would be an example, or the Christian apocryphal Acts of Apostles, that sometimes show philosophical sophistication, but rather pedestrian Greek. So it's wrong to look at Mark and to judge the level of his education by the level of his rhetoric. And so I think Richard's exactly right, that there are other reasons for thinking that Mark himself is Pepagogmenus.
Yeah.
How do you deal with Matthew? I mean, we don't have to go extensively, but because he's so focused on creating a new Moses, a better Hebrew version of Jesus, and he is writing in Greek, I hear he's kind of repetitive, kind of poetic in a way. But yet he can't get like Hebraisms of like a colt and an ass.
It's obvious that Matthew is much more facile with Greek than he is with Hebrew. He's reliant on the Septuagint for his understanding of the Old Testament. And like you mentioned something people might not know what we're referring to, but there's the passage in Matthew. So first it starts in Mark, right? Mark, the triumphal entry. Jesus rides into town on a donkey, rides into Jerusalem. And this is scriptural reference. It comes right out of Scripture. There's the reasons why he's telling the story. Matthew retells the story, and he knows the passage that Mark is looking at in the Old Testament. He goes there and he reads it in the version that he has, which is probably the Septuagint. But even if he had read it in the Hebrew, it doesn't matter. He reads it, and he sees what is in the original, the Hebrew style, which gets translated into Greek, so the style is carried over. Repetition. So like is a common form of Hebraic poetic writing is that you would say a thing and then you would re-say the thing in the next line in different words, and then just do this repetitive thing. Matthew mistakes this as saying two separate things.
Exactly
And so he says that there's the donkey, because the original passage says there's a donkey, a foal of a donkey, right? So Matthew says, oh, it's the donkey and a foal of a donkey. And so says Jesus rides into Jerusalem simultaneously on a mother donkey and its baby donkey, which I can't even picture in my head how this is physiologically possible. But he has this because he's trying to be, for whatever reason, he's trying to be more literally faithful to the original text, and he doesn't understand Hebraism in this context. Whereas someone who was an expert in the Hebrew Torah at the time would have gotten that. They would have understood, and as clearly Mark did, right? And even Luke, who's probably a native Greek speaker, who's also working from the Septuagint, even he doesn't make that mistake. Like he when he tells the story, he does not borrow Matthew's mistake of the two donkeys. He goes back to Mark and says, no, it's the original donkey. So even Luke knows more about how Hebraic structure works than Matthew does. But nonetheless, Matthew is definitely a Jew, right? He's definitely pro-Torah observant Christianity. Yeah. So he's probably a diaspora Jew. He's someone who grew up in a Greek-speaking community. We know there were tons of lifelong Jews from ancient families of Jews that no longer were very facile with Hebrew. They were. That's why the Septuagint was so popular. Is that it was the only access point they had left to get to. It was only educated rabbis would bother learning the Hebrew and stuff. So that's who Matthew is. He's someone outside Judea who's not as competent with Hebrew as Mark clearly is. Which illustrates the point we were making earlier that Mark knows more stuff than it looks like he does because he's choosing to speak in a colloquial idiom.
Ladies and gentlemen, join MythVision's Patreon not only to support us, but there are 72 videos that I did with Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald and Richard Carrier, all on the Patreon, early access. You guys can ask personal questions when I go to interview these scholars, and you're helping MythVision grow.